the one you need to know. I'm the map. Remix King. Remix King. I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there. I bet. I'm the map. 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 I'm the map.
Hey everybody, good evening. Welcome to Dig FM. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nat Robinson. I work for Beezwax, and I will be the guest speaker today. And I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about I'm going to share my screen first. And I'm going to talk to you about a function library that's meant to make our lives easier as programmers. So if I can get my keynote going. All right. I got to thank Eric for his suggestion of integrating one of my pictures from my community theater productions with my theme. So Eric said, "Oh, that kind of looks like you're a pirate." I went, "All right, I can work with that." So the talk today is about two custom function libraries called collections and maps. And what they do is they take the functionality that we have in FileMaker with JSON arrays and JSON objects and expands and hopefully makes it much easier for you to take the logic in your head and put it down into the code. So a little bit about myself. I was born in Massachusetts. I came out to Santa Cruz to study marine biology because that's what I thought I wanted to do when I was 18. That took me to a job at a biotech where I was pipetting in a QC QA lab, and they used FileMaker there. And they were having all kinds of problems with their systems, and I had a very small background in Visual Basic that my dad taught me because he was a software guy. And before I knew it, I was making FileMaker databases for all the different departments, and then they made me the IT guy for a few years. And although I did plug in printers and things like that, mostly what I wanted to do was FileMaker databases. From there, I worked for a ocean sustainability nonprofit called Fishwise in Santa Cruz. And then one day, after I became a freelancer for a little bit, I showed up to what I thought was a neat networking event called Dig FM. And when I was there, I met Jay Gonzalez and Vince Manano. And they said, "Do you like being a freelancer?" And I said, "No, not really." And next thing you know, I was working at Beezwax. And that was just about 3 years ago. As well, one of my main hobbies is community theater. I kind of fell into it 12 or 13 years ago, and I've absolutely loved it. Probably been in 20 or 25 plays in the last 12 or 13 years. We have a great community theater scene down here. One of the biggest things I miss about pandemic life is not being able to do theater, along with regular human interaction. And my wife and I got a dog last year, a pandemic dog, although we did get him right before the pandemic. His name is Teddy, and he is a Basset and Dachshund mix, which are two long, loud dogs, very low to the ground. There's a picture of my wife and I acting in the cherry orchard a year and a half ago. And that was the time that my wiener dog met the Wienermobile. That was a real special time. You can kind of see the family resemblance. And if that's not enough of the wiener dog for you, this is what he looked like when he was a puppy. Oh. Okay, so Eric tried to give me an idea to make this a fun presentation, which I forgot, technical presentations can be fun. So the theme I went with was wise things that my directors have told me. And if you get this reference, I love you, because this is one of my favorite characters from The Simpsons. All right, so what's your motivation? A question you often get from a director. usually when they don't think you quite have figured out what you're doing in that scene. Well, the reason I got into why I gravitated towards development was because I saw that specifically with FileMaker, you could really empower the teams that you worked with to do what they do best. You can, if somebody is a specialist in managing, basically managing people, then they don't need to really spend 2/3 of their day fighting with spreadsheets. So I take that principle of maximizing the potential of the people that I work with in the companies and the clients that we have, and I kind of took that and said, let's apply that towards the developers. And in some ways, let's apply that. It's how comedians, the best comedians, tell jokes they think are funny. I said, well, how would I want to be treated? And so one of the main principles is that our time and our ability to handle things, our bandwidth, are some of the most valuable pieces in a project. Oftentimes, the developer's time, the developer is one of the more highly paid people involved, and that's just from a financial perspective, but also in terms of being specialized and being important. And so that's what I kind of approach this with, is that our time and our bandwidth is extremely valuable. I think about what we do as devs. As devs, yeah, there's sort of coding and there's sort of technical expertise. But really what we're best at, because we can learn other languages. You can take what you know from one language and jump into another language. Really what we do best is logic. We think in terms of, we solve problems, we come up with flows, and we don't just come in as these sort of tech whizzes. We really end up oftentimes knowing the workflows of our clients better than they know them, and really helping them craft it. And I think that's something that definitely, as you get on in your dev career, you get better at. You can't be a dev without enjoying people, I think. I mean, I'm sure oftentimes you don't want to deal with people, but you really, we help people and we deal with people a lot. And we help them find the workflows. And I mean, I used to, when Claris came up with Workplace Innovation Platform, it at first sounded like it's buzzwords to me. But over time, it really sunk in like, oh, you really do have the ability with something like FileMaker, which you can change things, you can demo, like you can do a lot in FileMaker within a meeting with a client that you really oftentimes don't have the ability to do in other platforms. So that was something that really jumped out at me, is that we have the chance to help people work through their workflows. So I looked at, okay, what I like to build reusable pieces. When I see code that one of my colleagues has done, or that someone in one of the forums has put out, or on DigFM, I see technology and I see bits and pieces often, and I go, how can I put that in a block that is easy to use, easy to think about, has simple ins and outs, and you can just plug and play it, or at least you can kind of easily hook it into your existing systems. And these modules, to me, are about making it so that you no longer have to think about each little piece. As a dev, you can more think, okay, I want to do this. Let me think about what can I do, rather than how exactly do I have to do it. The less you have to think in the minutia of the how, the more time you have to really think about the logic and then really think about the workflows. So that's, in my mind, when you build a module, it's really being able to take that sort of logic code barrier, similar to this blood-brain barrier, that logic code barrier, and make that as smooth a transition as possible. A musician can record and they can just jam out whatever they can jam out and they can record it. and it's there, it's very hard as a coder to be able to just jam out. And FileMaker, maybe more so than other languages that are just pure text code, you could argue that that's probably one of the hurdles with FileMaker, is that you can't just jam out with your fingers and just put your thoughts in. There's no way around that. That's not how scripts are built. But what we can do is try to simplify it and try to provide common avenues towards the logic that we all kind of think in and we share, and eliminate some of those little tiny time burglars, those little attention burglars that come up. That's another Simpsons reference if you get the time burglars one. And this is one that I've always had, is there's a very popular term called thinking outside the box. I think we all know what it means, and it's saying you're in this box and don't be confined by it. Think outside of it. And I always like to say, well, maybe the problem is that we've put these walls up that actually aren't there. You know, we think of the way that solutions have been made, or the sort of general coding, you know, within the very strict confines of the example files and things like that. But in reality, there's all different ways that you can use FileMaker. I don't know anybody, I haven't met a single developer who hasn't hacked something in FileMaker to make it, you know, either the UI that they wanted or the logic that they wanted. So we've all kind of realized that the box that we're in as FileMaker devs is actually a good deal larger than we give it credit for when we first step in. There's a, you know, not to harp on the theater, and I'll get to the code in a second. In improv, there's I had a teacher who introduced us to the 1 banana rule, and the 1 banana rule is, they're the rules that we make up, that nobody said you couldn't do that. Someone will, I just saw something in the chat. I'll leave it. They're the rules that they're not actually the rules. They're just what we assumed the rules were. And the name 1 banana comes from our teacher was at the grocery store with one of her girlfriends, and they're in the fruit section, and she grabs a bunch of bananas, and then her girlfriend just takes 1 banana, and she looks at her and she goes, "What are you doing?" She goes, "I'm just having a banana." He's like, "You can take 1 banana?" "Yeah, you can take 1 banana." Oh. And that's where it comes from. Nobody actually said you couldn't take 1 banana. We just always assume that you can only take a bunch of bananas. I hope that analogy works. So those are the principles that I like to work in. That, you know, FileMaker has its sort of general conventions, but everything can be worked around. And if you just kind of look at what the actual ability of the program is in terms of what it can mechanically do and where it can store information, you'd be surprised how many things we just kind of think, oh, I need a plugin for that, or the dreaded having to tell the client, I know that web does that, but FileMaker doesn't do that. And there are definitely those things that they don't do, but more often than not, there's some way to get FileMaker to do it. So wise words from my directors: focus on the obstacles to your objectives. That was one of my favorite productions, Julius Caesar. So when we think about JSON is completely revolutionary. It gave us the ability to store complex structured data in 1 text block or 1 field. If you have a bunch of data that you want the UI to use, you can toss it in 1 field in that record. When you come to that record, your UI can go and grab that and do a bunch of stuff with it, display whatever it wants to. And that's huge. The other major league thing that JSON gave us was this ability to pass parameters through scripts that were as complex as we needed. You could pass entire records, you could pass entire found sets, you could nest within, I mean, JSON allows you to nest to your heart's content. I mean, you could nest an object within an array and then an object 500 times over, and it supports that. And you can go and grab those. And so that was huge with JSON. JSON is awesome. When my mind opened up to JSON, it was like, oh my gosh, what have I been doing for the last, probably 5 or 6 years before I had really used JSON as parameters. But there are some limitations. One of the things that you'll see is that it's plain text. That's it. All you get with a JSON array or an object is plain text, and you can get, and it'll support emojis and other things like that. But if you are trying to pass rich text between one source, like you've got it in a text box and somebody's typing up rich text, and then you want to carry that out and put it into another record or save it for later for some reason, you end up having to do something where you kind of can hack it with get as CSS, but you lose a lot of that. Binary files, so basically container files, those will not store in JSON, and rightfully so. You can convert them to base 64 in file name, but that can often be a pretty big performance hit when you start to talk about converting into base 64 for large files and then encoding and then decoding. And when you start to talk about passing things back and forth from the server and you have these like 20 megs worth of text, those things, they can be a hassle. With objects, I came across something, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but I was getting objects that had periods in the keys, in the key of the object. And there was no way for me to get that out of FileMaker using JSON get elements. I knew what the key was, but I couldn't grab it from that object. I couldn't grab the value of that key because of how it was written and the assumption that FileMaker made with nesting, which is incredibly useful. But it did bring me to a point where I couldn't get that. And another one came up with something that had a bracketed number, which FileMaker said, oh, you're talking about an array within there. I also came into a situation where objects had carriage returns in the keys. So when I went to go iterate through them, I hit these keys that weren't, I couldn't figure out if they was 2 keys or 1 key. And the same thing came up with listing your values in JSON. Or listing your values in an object or an array. It was indistinguishable from carriage returns to a separate value. It's not always a problem for a lot of people, but it would be nice to be able to have that storage where you didn't have these hiccups, because there's no way to know sometimes when you hit one of these. And then the other thing that I felt that got in the way for me with JSON from time to time was that I always had to deal with these iterators. I always had to, if I wanted to iterate through keys, I had to make a list of keys, and then I had to set a variable, and I had to do a loop, an exit loop if, and then iterates a variable, and then I grab the get value of that, and then I grab the value of that key that I got, and it ended up being, I could tell it was kind of taxing my brain to have to deal with all that. Arrays start at 0, and I was like, oh, but there's a count, and I had to keep balancing this -1. While loops as well as scripts dealt with some of these, and then I had some situations where I needed to insert records within an array, and I didn't know how to do that. And then I had ones where I needed to trim down an array from 100 to the top 20, and I realized how much code I was dealing with to do that. and asking for the size of the array. You always had to remember how big the array was, and so to me that was getting in the way of the logic that I wanted to do. Like I just had the thought, like I want to take the top 20 rows of this array, or I want to insert this value into this array, or I want to loop through these keys and know exactly what the key and the value is, or I want to loop through these array elements without having to deal with an iterator. So I ended up that was a big part of what drew me to this, was that dealing with iterations was a very taxing thing, and I found it was very easy for me to make a mistake. You got your I's, and now you're within an I, now you got a J, and there was something that really got to me. So that was kind of what bore these two function libraries, collections and maps. Collections are effectively the function library, the function library that deals with what are arrays, so organized collections, so sort of ordered sets, and then maps, which are mapped by keys. So there's a unique key that gives you a value. Real quickly, the key elements to a collection are everything is stored in variables. They are stored so you can put any variable style data in them. You can specify between global and locally stored. Everything can be grabbed by an index, which is almost akin to an element number, although the indexes start at 1. Some of the sweet things you can do are you can ingest from an array with one step. You can output to an array with one step. Binary files, rich text format. No iterator is needed. You can directly access element data, and I'll get into that, without kind of having to look at the size. You don't have to parse an entire block of text to get to this piece. There's a pointer that takes you right to it. And there's no character that's off limits for this collection ID. Whereas if you call it a variable name, you only have a set of characters you can use for a variable name. With the collection ID, you can give it anything, and that includes, IDs and things like that, which is actually one of the key points. All right, so this is one of my directors told me this once. Nobody wants to watch you think, just do the damn thing. All right, so I'm going to show you collections in action. All right, so let's stop sharing. No, wait, keep sharing, but share this. Okay. All right. Again, thank you, Eric, for the idea here on this theme. So here we'll go into collections. So this is really just a tool to kind of showcase it. We can take a look at the. We'll get into a little bit more of this, but I'll add this file. I'll make this file available. I'll also have a sort of nicer, prettier version when I do a blog post next week for Beezwax. But let's start with some code here. So let's just append this collection. We're going to call this collection ID test. And the reason why we're adding the $$ is that's how you tell a collection that it's global. Is you just give the name a $$. If you don't do that, it's going to be stored as local variables, and it'll work great in your scripts, but you won't be able to deal with it on a global way, and it's certainly not in a UI like this. So I'm going to say collection append 1, and this is the code right here, COLL.append test 1. So I'll execute that. Right now I have 1. Let's add 2. Execute. Let's add 3. Execute. And this portal here is just looking into the collection. It's not actually creating records. You can see that the result was 1 because this was success. If we look into the data viewer, oops, aha, mistake. Give me 1 second, guys. I need to clear my map from my earlier. There we go. Aha, so this is what it looks like in the data viewer. So this is what it's doing. It's saying you've created your collection. We're storing the ID, the current index, and the size as variables. And then we're storing 1, 2, and 3 right now as the elements. And that's the basis of how the collection works. So you can see that this is a collection. It's called test. This is a unique MD5, which basically prevents if you put in a character in here that wouldn't fit as a variable and we had to filter it out. And then here's the number. It's sortable. That's why I use the omega, so that it'll sort to the bottom if you have a bunch of other variables. But that's the way the storage works. So you can append to your heart's delight. If you want to iterate through these, all you have to do is say collection dot go to next, and you execute that. And now we're on 1. Now we're on 2. Now we're on 3. When we get to 3, if we say collection go to next, you get a negative result. That's a key element to how the iteration works. So I'm going to show a code example right now. All right, day of week. So I hope everyone can see this. But if you were to get a list of days and you wanted to just make, this is the output you'll get. Sunday is the number 1 day of the week through Saturday is the number 7 day of the week. Here's how you would traditionally do it. You start your iterator. You'd set the max for your iterator, which in this case is the value count. You have your message starting. You increment your variable, and then you say exit loop if that's greater than my max. Then you get the value, and then you build your message. So this bit of code here, 3 through 11, is 9 lines of code. It works. If you come to a collection, what you do is you create the collection from list, which is a call in collections. Then all you have to do is say not collection go to next, and this will give you a negative when it's done, and this will do the incrementing. So your day is just collection.get days, and then your message, you just say collection.get current index would be the number here. This was, and this is one example, was 11 lines. What was it? Sorry, it was 9 lines of code, and now it's 7. Not much, but a little bit, right? If you were to do it as an array, right? You've got this array here. You've created Sunday through Saturday as an array. Oops, I guess my message, I didn't set that up right. Anyway. Oh, days array here. So not important. All right, so what you do is you build the collection from the array, and then you just do the same situation. Go to next days. This is going to give you a negative when it's done, and then you just say get current index from an array. As opposed to if you have an I, if you're dealing with an iterator, you have to say I is 0, and I max is value count of list keys of days array. That's 3 pieces you have to think about. And then you're iterating with your variable through. You're saying I is greater than I max, getting elements of I minus 1. Again, this is taking 9 lines of code and turning it into 7. Okay, let's start with something else. Let's say I've got a list of 20 items here. I want to bring that into a collection. Okay, I've got 20 elements in my collection, and I want to spit that out as an array. I've got that 20 as an array now. If I wanted to do that in traditional iterating code, I'd end up with, I'd have to iterate through, and then I have to set an element. And if I wanted to go from an array to a list, I'd have to do something very similar. All of these, they don't necessarily, they're taxing in this way that you just kind of have to think about this iterator over and over. So here's something where this takes 9 lines of code. With a collection, it takes 2 lines of code. Collection from list, collection to array, and you're done. I came up with the situation where I have 20 elements in an array. I pull them in. And I need to get rid of the top 10. If I was to do that in traditional code, I'd have to ask for the size of the array, and then I'd have to go to delete element 11 10 times, or I'd have to go to delete element 20, iterate back. With a collection, all you have to do is say set size equal to 10, execute to array. It's that easy. So in some ways, it's taken a lot of the basic level of dealing with iterations and completely cleaned it out. You can do anything. You can basically jump around the array as you see fit. There's a first, last, next, previous. Go to 0 will take you back to the beginning. So that's kind of just the basic introduction to coding through a collection. I have a few more examples that I'd like to show. Just a moment. Yeah, so this is another one. So what does a while loop look like normally? You'd say while, you set your initial conditions to I equals 1, you have your result. I max is now the value count. In the conditions that I is less than I max, we get the value, we get the result, and we iterate I max, and then we return the result. To me, that's a lot to deal with. When we get into a collection, all of a sudden, all you do is say, build it from the list, go to next is the only iterator you need to think of, because this will be positive as long as there's next. You get the day, and you get the, yeah, it's tough to troubleshoot while. And you get this. And I don't know about everybody here, but I have definitely forgotten to iterate the index or the I value in a while loop, and that doesn't go very well. So again, these aren't like light years different, but all of a sudden you have a tool for just saying, okay, I'm good. I don't need to think about iterating. I have a way to get through this, and I have a very much in the spirit of the for eaches that you've seen in a lot of other languages. So that's the real basics of what we have here. There's no size limit. I mean, you can, 200 from list, it'll do it. One of the things I also want to showcase here is, let's say I have this is some weird text. Collection, let's clear it first. Let's just go collection.append data, which will get it from this field, right? Let's just add a bunch, right? So now I have stored in an array style, completely rich text formatted. So if I wanted to go and say, I want to go get element 5, there it is. Now, that's not something you can do with an array. So that was kind of one of the big impetuses for me too. Now, let's say I have a, I don't know, file in here. Oops, let's not put that one there. Let's say I have just a screenshot here, right? And I've got that, and I say collection.append file, execute. Now, it comes in as just screenshot 2021, but if I want to get that, if I want to say collection.get, and I go to that last one, obviously if I try to export it to text, it's just going to give me that, but this is a container field here. I can pull it out as the container. So what I can do is I can make a stack of 25 container files and then go do something with that. Where that may come up is if you have invoices for a job and you're saying, I need to go take all these invoices and I need to go carry them with me and then put them in an email. Or I need to go copy these attachments from this file, from this record to this record. All of a sudden, you can pile up those files and just go drop them off. There's no other way to do that without setting up a relationship and then kind of creating records and then pushing them over. So that was one of the things that really drew me towards collections. The other ones were, I thought about how much work it is to parse a text block. So if I can do this, actually, let me show you one more thing. I'll stick with this, right? Let's say I have these massive text blocks, right? What does my data viewer look like? All right, you've asked the right question. Oh, with the, are you asking about with the files in it?
With the rich text.
With the rich text, yeah. With the rich text, the data viewer doesn't show up. Yeah, that's one of the bummers, yeah. Rich text. You don't see it in the data viewer, right? Let's clear that out. And then let's just append the data, right? And then let's append the file. Yeah, the data viewer just shows the name of the file. The data viewer basically shows you that what would happen if you were to export this as text. And that, yeah, there's no, you can do things like say, if you export this to a field, you'll see what it is, right? But even if you ask for it in the data viewer calculation, it'll just give you this text representation. The only difference is if you ask for it as get CSS. So if I said, right, if you do get as CSS, it carries that with it, and that's the way that FileMaker stores rich text. If maybe someone from Claris can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two things it stores. It stores sort of the HTML version of it, and then it stores the plain text version of it. For if you put it anywhere that doesn't accept rich text, it'll do the plain text, and if you put it somewhere that it rich text, it'll take its I guess XML probably, and put that towards it. But if you ask for the CSS, you can see it's got that formatting in it. And then the same way, if you said, you know, get as or base 64 decode of this, oops, base 64 encode. You see all that. So FileMaker is storing the actual, binary file, but it's not displaying it in the data viewer. I saw a chat in there. I thought text was only storing 2 bytes per character. Yeah, it seems like it stores the rich text to use later. So that was kind of, I didn't know that until I started messing with this. So that's just like one element there. Another one is, so there's performance issues when you get to enormous arrays, and I don't have time to get into too much of it because it actually takes a little while. But if you say I'm going to use a simple list, right, of 2000, and I've just got a loop creating this, you can bring that in here, and you've got a 2000 size array, and you can turn it into an array, and you can do anything you want with it. When you start to get to these enormous numbers with FileMaker, the problem is that it needs to parse the string, and it's got something under the hood that I don't understand that does a better job. But when you start to talk about building arrays and breaking down arrays, once these arrays get enormous, like let's say you have 20,000 arrays and each one is a complex object, the text parsing gets really tricky. So I'm gonna show you. Basically, I'm gonna show you what happens when you try to give FileMaker a giant object. Right. So I've got this here is. So here is 100 of this giant object, right? When I bring it in into collections, it just comes in instantaneously, and then I can go through and I can run right through it to my heart's delight, iterate through it, whatever. When I try to pull these apart using pure code, it has to read that entire block and go, okay, that's element 1, that's element 2, that's element 3, that's element 4. And if I was trying to manipulate this and then add these elements back, it has to then address that whole block of text over and over and over and over. Something that I found was very prohibitively non-performant. And with this one, you can say, okay, just go to an array. And I don't think I touched on this earlier, but the collection output for toArray will take a look at whatever data you give it and determine whether it's a string or it's a legitimate JSON object. So if I was to say, let's cut this back down to, I don't know, 2, right? Let's just cut it down to 2. By the way, that would have taken forever otherwise. If we cut it down to 2 and then we say, okay, let's add for the third element, let's just call it how are you? Let's do the old hello world. Hello world, right? You append that, get hello world. If I was to then say, okay, well, this one is, this is actually an array. And I append that. A lot of times it's easy to just default and say, just do it as a string. The collection library says, no, I'm going to treat every element as I see it. If I see a legitimate JSON object, I'm going to add it as an object to this array. If I see a legitimate JSON array, I'm going to add it as an array. So this is what happens when you export this as an array. You get the first object, you get the second object, but then you get a text string, and then you get an actual JSON array that you can then search for by nesting. So that was important to me, that what came into what you added to a collection, if you were to turn it into an array, it respected the data type that you gave it. And I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's really the meat and potatoes of collections. There's other bells and whistles we can get into. Like, let's say we come in from this array, we have 100. If I want to combine it with another array, like let's say this is test, let's call it 2 now, and I'm saying I want a from array with this 2. If I say I want to combine test, actually let's say I want to combine 2 with test, I just say combine, execute that, and now this one is twice the size, containing the array you started with and the array you added to the back end. If I want to clone this collection, I can start with 2 and then 3. Right? And if we go to take a look at 3, you'll see that that shows up. Right. What does the data viewer look like? This is the major drawback. Do I have a function to clean all that? Yeah. Well, I have clear. Clear will clear it all out. That was something that's, I would say that's probably the next phase of this. Yeah. Is you can tell it to clear what you have there easily, and that'll just get rid of everything. There isn't a tracker of what collections exist. And that's a thought for the V2. And I'll get into kind of the thoughts with versioning on this and how it would be wonderful if the community at large wanted to give their suggestions. A sort of clear all globals might be a nice way to deal with that, where you sort of have an array maybe that keeps track of all the globals that you've built. And as you clear them, you clean that out, but you can just say clear all globals. But yeah, the data viewer will get crowded. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The data viewer gets extremely crowded while you're doing this. I'd say that's the major drawback, is that I don't know another way to store this data in a performant go get it way, other than to use either individual variables or to use repeating variables, which really there's almost no difference between the two. You can't just say clear a whole repetition of variables, which would be nice if you could. You have to keep tabs on that. And so in the end, repeating variables and separate variable names act very similar. But yeah, you come in, 2, clear that. And then here you have, let's just say set size down to 4 again of, what are we on, test now? One of the reasons I put in the collection ID here was for the specific purpose, so that you could find out what your collection ID was and then be able to clear it out. Test. So if we set it to 4, you see exactly that. So what we're keeping track of with each of these collections is we have the ID for this purpose of being able to debug. We also keep track of that current index. And as we iterate through, you'll see when you say go to next, it just adds 1 to that. When you say go to next, adds 1, adds 3, adds 4. And then go to next, all it's doing is saying, is my current index at my size? Yep, then I'm going to return a negative result. And that's it. And the same thing if you want to go to the back and go previous, previous. Once you get to 1, it goes, nope, can't go back anymore, and it'll give you a negative result. That was in the end, that was the main impetus, was that it keeps track of its own iterations, so you don't have to think about it at all. So that's collections. Collections have a very specific usage. I find one of the nicest things about collections is that you don't have to remember how many pieces you've given them already. And I'm going to show you an example. And Vince talked about transactions a couple weeks ago. And Brendan was nice enough to say, yeah, you can use my transactions prototype file. So I'm going to go ahead and go through what a collection looks like in action. So here is just a sort of dummy prototype file. We're going to create a new project, and that project is going to have, let's say, 5 or 6 tasks. I don't know if there are triggers on here, but there are triggers on these fields. Solid programming. Matt Robinson, date today, project budget, 20,000, let's say. Let's add some subtasks to this. 1,000, priority low, status approved. Let's add another one. 6, 500, high, in progress, and let's add a third one. And you could add as many as you wanted, right? That's the point of having these kind of open portals. This uses local tables to kind of store temporary sets of data, and then says, I'll gather what I have in the local tables, and I'll push that towards as a transaction, right? So you don't know exactly how many records you're going to have to create. You're going to have to create your parent project, and then you're going to have to create X number of child tasks. I don't really know that you are always going to know, right? So what you do is you go to create, and in this script, you get all this, and this is local stuff that I hope Brendan will get into the details of this sometime, because this stuff is really, Vince kind of introduced some of these concepts, but. So what we've done is we've started by opening up a new collection, and this collection is just got a 0. So new just makes the collection and gives it a size of 0. Each object within this transaction collection is instructions on what to do, what changes to make to the database. It's a create, right? If you're creating, you give it you're saying, I'm going to give it a new ID, and I'm going to give it all the field values. If you know, and so each object in a transaction array represents one database change. So what you do is you stack up a pile of all the changes. Maybe there's the base record, then there's 15 child records, and oh, I actually need to remember I need to up the count on the parent record. Oh, and then I need to up the count on the grandparent record too. So with transactions, because you have to send in everything as one, so that if one piece fails, all of it fails, you don't always know going in, like, okay, there'll be 8 records, right? So you come in here and you make an object, and you add that object to this transactions array. Oh, there's an edit to the solution. Oh, well, there you go. Then you add that. If I was doing this with an array, I'd have to set an array and then say, okay, I plus 1. Oh, I plus 1. So every time I did any of this, I'd have to go, wait a minute, did I increment the I? Because now I need to go set element of I plus 1 minus 1 because I'm an array. All right. And then it goes and it looks at the tasks that you had given it, right? and it just starts looping through these. And actually, Brendan, you could have used a collection for the task count too.
I know, I see that now.
But so as you hit each one of these, you get to just add it to the collection, and all you have to do is use append. You don't have to think about exactly where you were before. So you just start appending all these, right? I think there were 3 of them, so I should be hitting that. Yep. And then what you end up with is a collection that has everything. And we can look at, let's look at the, where are you, data viewer? So yeah, so here's your collection down here. It's got, each one of these has a whole set of field data, and this was Brendan's genius for figuring out how to craft an entire set of instructions into an object. There's the 5 objects. One of them is the project. One of them is the solution. One of them and 3 of them are the tasks. And you can just kind of stack them up together. And then all you have to do is say, set the array equal to collection.toArray. All right. And then you've got this transaction array here. And we'll give it a JFE there. And that's got everything that you needed. So that you basically were able to just keep piling things on without having to really think about where you were. And Brendan and I have done migrations that use this same technique. And in the migrations, oftentimes you may be stacking up 1,000 records at a time. And you need all of them to fire as part of one transaction, because if a couple of them aren't and they're related in some hierarchy of records, then you've put yourself in a situation where you have some records that don't fit the mold, right? So when we switched over to using the collections, it got so much easier, because you may be going to 4 or 5 different places to grab all these pieces you want to append. And if you had to keep rebuilding the object or the array every time you went and touched it, the performance would really start to hurt. So yeah, so that's a practical use of where Brendan was able to just go and say, I'm going to go do XYZ, 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 without that little bit of, well, where's your counter? Where's this? So I'm not, I mean, I guess we can go through the whole thing, but eventually it works. And there it is at the bottom with this 3 tasks. So that's just one example of where a collection was able to help really just streamline the thinking process. Okay, that's one. So I talked about collections, and I want to talk about maps too. So maps are this is the yin and the yang. Maps are the object version. So let's actually use one of the objects from our other example. If I come in here, right, I have this object, and I say I want to make a map from this object. So it does the same thing. It goes in, it says, I'm going to take all of the pieces that you gave me, and I'm going to stick them as a map. But it can't call them 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the same way, because it's not a collection, right? So the data viewer here ends up looking like, oh, all right, here we go. So the data viewer here looks somewhat reminiscent, right? We're going to go down here to the map. We're going to say, okay, we have an index for when we do want to iterate. We have a map name. Needs refresh, I'll explain in a little bit. That has to do with when you continually set the same key over and over, not thinking that you have 2 of the same keys, right? It tells you what the size is, and then, not to get into too much of the detail, but it's basically, this is what type it is, this is the name, this is the unique key, the unique MD5 to go with the map name, this is the key name, and then this is the unique MD5 to go with the key name. It's the way to protect exactly what you've given it, right? So that's what you get with a map. With a map, you also need to keep track of all your keys. So there's a collection that gets made with every map that is just a collection of all the unique keys. Because when you start to iterate through these keys, you need to make sure that because I set eye color once and then I set it again, I don't end up with 2 eye colors. And if I'm deleting keys out of this, I'm able to do that. All right, so that is, again, there's a lot that goes into the data viewer. You can't get around that. But there's a very similar feeling here that you can iterate through in a very simple way. All you do is say, you've brought it in, you go to next, 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 until you get to the end. So in that loop looks very similar to the loop that you would have seen with the collections. Whereas, and I think I have a good example in here. When you start to think about the way that you would construct looping through a map's keys, you have to first get the list of keys. Then you have to iterate through that list and then grab the value, the key name from that text string. And then you need to grab the value based on that key name that you got from that text. So I'm going to do something here to kind of highlight one of the issues with that. By the way, map, just as collection has a remove, map has a delete. So you can delete, let's say, tags. Execute, it's gone. You can delete, longitude. Gone, right? And I'll just kind of go through these and try to keep this a little bit simpler just for this current example. Oh, by the way, you can stack up your map, right? And you just export it as an object. Very simple, right? So I wanted to show one example. I'm gonna, just to be sneaky. Here is a very simple JSON object. Key A, B. You can easily see A becomes B. Here's another object, right? Right? A contains an object that has got key of B, which contains C. Super simple, right? You can pull that in fine. And to get that, you'd say JSON get element, sample data, sample text, A.B. That's how you go get that. Gives you C. Easy, right? But what if your object looked like this? And you said, well, I don't actually know what my object looks like yet, so I am going to just get a list of keys. Sample text. Oh, cool. A.B. Perfect. I will just JSON get element of my sample text, and I will just use my key to grab that will use my key to grab that. There's nothing wrong with my code. What happened is FileMaker assumes that because you had an a.b, you meant I have an object where the key of A has another object within it that has a key of B. Which, with how FileMaker thinks about it, I go, perfect, that makes sense. But what about this situation? What about when an API gives you this value? There is literally no way for FileMaker to get this value from this. There's no way natively to do that. Whereas, if you bring it in here, there's the key right there. That's one of them. Another one would be the difference between A right. Well, FileMaker will try to get that by saying A 0, right? Because it's an array with the element of 0 within it. How to get to C. But what happens, and this actually happened to one of my colleagues. What happens if that's what you got? There's no way FileMaker can go and get this. This data is locked away from the native functions and you can't get it. Whereas here, you can get it. Now, the same would apply to, what if someone is expecting an object that looks like that? What if somebody's expecting an object that looks like a.b? Well, JSON set element a.b value C JSON string. This is also a lot of typing to get this to add in elements. Can't do it. So those two objects that I showed, they are impossible to create through the native means. Now, when we're talking about maps, all you have to do is say map dot set a.b C, right? Needs to be refreshed. There it is. I think one of my refreshes isn't quite working right, but it's there, right? So you have an a.b equals C. What if you want to call it a3 dot C? Execute. There it is, right? And then if you want to put that into an object, there it is. There's no way to create this object with native FileMaker. And I came across this when I needed to give keys that had website names. I had a client that needed website names as keys for something that they use for their own another API. I wasn't able to give it to them. Every time I tried, it ended up being that cascading nested object, which wasn't what I wanted. So this immediately gets over this. The other thing that's kind of a neat bell and whistle is, let's say I want to give it a key of A carriage return B. How do you do? You can use emojis as key names. You may actually be able to do that in FileMaker too. Vince loves emojis, by the way. Map a.b. So we execute that, right? Now we've got a.b. But what if what if this was, so this was the object, right? That maybe I had to use to create this. But what happens when I try to list these keys of this object? Ah, Christopher Edwards, you are right. Yeah, FileMaker does support, we should just use emojis for variable names from now on. Hey, you're welcome to do it. I think it's a great idea. What happens when I go to get listing my keys here? Which I always have to do this extra blank colon or blank quote. I get, okay, A, B, A.B, A0, A3.C. Cool. Those are the keys I'm going to iterate through, and I'm going to get all the values here, and I'm going to do something with all those values. That's not right, though, is it? This is a carriage return. There's no way for me to get the list of keys in FileMaker other than JSON list keys. But when I come across a carriage return, JSON list keys would lead me to believe that I have 5 keys here, whereas I only have 4. Hence, I can use a map instead, knowing that all I need to do to get through the map. I don't know what an NFT is. Oh, those are the new art thing, right? Yeah. Seems like there's some easy money to be made there. So when you're dealing with maps, all you have to do is just loop through your map and you're good. So, you know, this is kind of, these were the other things that led me to think, okay, maybe there's a better solution than just relying on list keys and list values, right? And I'm going to show you an example of a system that uses maps. This was, this is a plugin. Basically, I have a client that says, I want to receive email and then take the email and dump it into a table with child table for attachments. It's actually a pretty it's a pretty common ask I've found. So I've built a few of these types of ingestion systems. This one uses the Dacon plugin, Mail It, because it works on Linux, and I needed to run this on Linux. And there's a few mail plugins that have similar functionality. This one was the one that worked on Linux, so good for you, Dacon, because it's the only one that I could use. What I've got coming in here is we have a we load up a bunch of data, right? And then when you get this giant profile object that includes everything from what the mailboxes are that we're looking for, what fields am I going to put all the data in. Eventually, we just store it as, rather than every time we need it, passing it around as a object between parameters, I just load it up as a global, and I call it profile data as a map. So profile data sits there and is a known quantity, right? When we go to actually unpacking this data, first of all I have to do is say, okay, let me get the layouts I need to work with from the profile data. It's a little cleaner system than having to either say, okay, here's a global that I loaded up, because you can use a name, or if you had a set of profiles that had IDs, you could just save the IDs and say, okay, get me the map. I'm talking to the map that belongs to this record. Okay, so I just give it the ID as the map name, and it'll handle everything. Okay, so you know, there's a lot that goes on with this. This is a really nice tool, blah, 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 blah. As I'm going through and I'm collecting collecting the data to use. I'm just setting message info, and I'm just saying, okay, this is where the subject is, this is where the to, this is the CC, BCC. So I'm not thinking about JSON set elements, message info, and then having to think about all the typing and all that jazz. You really just, I could do this with ands. I just do it as a list from my own visual. But you just say map set, 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 map set. And that just throws it in. And that stores it for you in a map, right? Get through, you've got text body, another set of setting maps. And then you've got this, you know, you can get it, right? So we're just using maps in a much more fluid way, I think, than constantly having to say JSON get element this, set element that. And that was what I meant with, it's much more fluid to just think in terms of get and set. And you can just kind of like let your brain just go, okay, get the map, get the map, get the map. It's a little easier to type. Because, you know, most of the time we don't think about strings, but if you are giving it an object or an array, and you eventually have to output that, it's gonna know what that is. It's gonna say, okay, that's an object and array. I'll go put it back as an object and an array. A little bit more. Here's something that I liked, right? So we get a list of attachments, because what I'm going to do with this script is I'm going to say, I'm going to, like most of the email ingestion plugins, basically allow you to grab everything ahead of time. You don't have to put it anywhere yet. But traditionally, if you were to say, I want to grab, just loop through the attachment info, I probably want to be on the attachments child record so I can put it somewhere right away. Because I'm just going to have file, etc. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, I'm going to have a collection that's going to store some UUIDs, and the UUIDs are going to be one for each attachment I get. So I'm just going to have this attachment UUIDs collection that's going to be blank to start, and I'm just going to append it with a new UUID, right? And then I'm going to get the file name, and I'm going to get all this stuff, and then I'm going to create a new map by that UUID. So I stored my UUID in a collection, and now I've got a map that goes by that UUID name. And when I come in here, I just say, okay, store the message parent ID. What's the foreign key of the message record, if that's how they're relating? Is it an inline? CID icon, which is a file. It's a binary file. Size, name, and then the file itself, which is a binary file. What I do is I just load up this map by the name of the UUID, and then I loop through, and if there's 5 of them, I've created 5 maps by these different UUIDs, and then I have a collection now that has 5 UUIDs. Right? So I have all the information I need to dump this into the attachments table. Right? There's a lot more that I'm doing with collections up here in terms of, I have a collection of all the fields on the message table and a collection of all the fields on the attachments table, so that when I come to the message table, I know that I can just say, what's the name of this field? And I can get from the profile data, what's the field name? What's the actual get field name? And what's the value for my message info? So basically I'm able to take these things and piece them all together and then just set the field, right? But here's looping through our attachments. So if collection get size ATTUIDs, so if I have any, all I have to do is use the get size. That'll give me a positive, which will be a true. I've got my list of attachment fields, which I've now put into a collection. I go to the layout, and I'm just going to loop through this UUID attachments. And as I get through those UUIDs, I just get it. So here I am. This is the first one. And I loop through each of the fields that I have. and I have a map by that UUID, right? Now the value, I have a map already sitting that includes the binary file, which is the attachment itself. And so as I loop through these, I have a map that I gave a specific name to, which I don't have to think about, okay, did I call that $ attachment 1, $ attachment 2? No, I just had it generate a UUID, give a map that UUID, and just keep a list of my UUIDs. And I go through that, and I know my script knows where to look to get all that binary file data and then deposit it in. So this was something I had written prior, and it took me so long to do it. When I switched to collections and maps, all of a sudden my brain could just look at these and get them. So that's probably the more complex usage, because it's, you got collections and maps and what you kind of do when you interdepend them. But that's the general idea, is that this was able to facilitate my thinking, my logic that I had for how to handle picking up information and then putting it somewhere a lot easier than when I was handling either separate variables or large JSON objects and arrays. I hope that this kind of makes sense, what I was doing here. It's a little heady if you're not in the collection and maps world, but in the end, I think it's fairly. I think it's kind of straightforward once you get into it. So that's like the long and short of collections and maps in action. I have a few more things I can touch on just in relation to some of the performance gains that I found. But what do these custom functions look like? Sample file available? Yes, totally. So I will make this file available. I guess I can just give that to you, Eric, right? These custom function files just look like this. I used COLL because I found collection was a lot to type. Each one of these is fairly simple. They all call the omega function, and the omega function is the one function to rule them all. This is where the entire logic of the library lives. Oh, cool, man. Thank you, Benedict. All the logic lives in the omega function. And the reason why I did this, and Brendan can attest to this, there's a lot of versioning that goes on and will continue to go on. And I need a collection of custom functions. That's very true. There's a lot of versioning that goes on. And so if you put all your logic in each one of the custom functions, then when you start to change the logic of several custom functions and you want to do an update, effectively you want to go in and patch this new version into a solution, or you want to say, hey, everybody who's using collections, by the way, here's a step of 12 different things you have to copy and paste to make the new functions work, or to make these, to patch these bugs, because it's code, it's going to have bugs in it. When you just say like every function calls this omega, all you have to do is copy, give the text out, and then just copy the new omega function in. Because I know that collection search is just going to call omega and give it a function of search, which is down in the S's, excuse me, and it's going to use this logic, right? So as long as this omega function logic is typo in the private functions comment. As long as the logic is in here, it's just a one step. So when you go to say, hey, this is version 1.01, where I fixed private functions called only Thank you. I would have, that would have been bothering me in the tiny piece of my brain, time burglar to me, if I didn't fix it. As long as you keep all your logic in one sort of core function, then all you have to do is just update this function and say, hey, here's the v1.2. Oh, and all it is here's the text for your omega. So you just come in, you copy and paste, bam. What I find is really difficult with these libraries of functions is that when you start to try to say, oh, what version are you using? Okay, I think you need to update the set size, right? I think you need to update the inject or the remove. Could you just get by with the call omega function? Do you need all the others? Yeah, the answer to that is truly yes. You could get by with just the call omega function. What you'd have to do is understand everything that goes in. Unfortunately, FileMaker with our custom functions, yeah, you'd have to memorize them. And with our custom function, with a plugin like MBS, it's designed in a way that it will accept as many parameters as you want to give it, right? But with custom functions that you build, natively, they only have a set number of parameters. So it gets really hard. And then are you asking someone to then, when they call the function, say, okay, well, you can call the omega function, but then you have to give it an array of data. It gets tricky, or an object of parameters. And that won't work if you're saying, well, what I'm trying to do is pass it, I'm trying to pass it a field with a container file. I'm trying to pass it rich text. Then you can't get in that mode. If there was a way, if in FileMaker 20, they give us the option to have as many parameters as we want, I don't think it's that bad. The other thing is, if you've ever been programming with, and MBS is one of my favorite plugins. Christian is awesome. He gave me a ride from the airport one time. It's very easy to lose track of where you are with your parameters when you start typing. And one of the goals here was to make it something that was very easily typable. As a programmer, you just kind of can get into it. The only downside I will say is that because a lot of these exist in the calculation to call, you have to set a voided variable, basically. Yeah, you have to set a voided variable to equal that calculation, because FileMaker currently doesn't have just a calculate or calculation script step, which would be cool. I actually think that'd be kind of a cool thing because of all the things where you just want to say all these types of things that people build, which is like I'm going to store some things as variables, or plugins that do like connecting to something or whatever. Thanks, Paul. Cool. So anyway, it's almost 7. I've used up a lot of time. I hope I didn't get too in the weeds. This is what the collection looks like. It's also written in a way that you can make your own adjustments to it fairly easily, and then you can make your own Omega files and send them out. And the maps are the same thing. It's the same running by with the Omega file. Okay, so I think I'm going voided variable. I'll show you. Right here. I want to make a collection called days from the days list that I have. I have to use call.fromList. The only reason I have to do this is because I need to get to a calculation window where I can talk to this. I need to get to a calculation window where I can call this function, because this function, it's just returning 1 or 0, and really it's going to return 1 every time because there's no way that it'll fail. So it's just going to give you a true return all the time, but you still need to get to a calculation window whereby you can call it. And if you've ever used any other similar types of sort of functions, you know what I mean. So what Brendan I got from him was just call it void as a variable, and then this is the logic. This void doesn't matter; it's just going to come back as 1 for this particular function. For these functions like call.goToNext, the result is important because it results in a true or a false. For this void here, it's a formality of set variable gets you to the calculation engine. If there was a calculation engine script step, I would be using that all over the place. Cool. I really appreciate everyone's time. All right, maps we already talked about. Yeah, so I'll finish with this. Faster, faster, faster. I could drive a truck between these lines. I actually really like that director. This is just a real quick look at what the performance comparisons were. When you're just talking about small arrays, thank you. When you're just talking about small arrays, and this was just saying, I'm basically going to unpack a list and I'm going to pack it back up. Or I'm going to just unpack an array and pack it back up. So just how long does it take to handle all the elements in here? When you're dealing with small stuff, it's tiny amounts of time, but the mechanics kind of take a little longer. Once you start to hit these big giant counts, 5,000 of a 10-digit UUID, you do see a performance gain. Where you really start to see it is when the string size gets insane. Okay, when you start to deal, thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity. Yeah, criticize me, please. I need it sometimes. Runs on during presentation, definitely. But once you get to these massive lists, when you start to talk about, okay, I'm going to take this list and I'm going to do X, Y, Z with it, that starts to really tax the system because every time you're talking to that list, you gotta parse that. If you're doing a get value, you have to talk to that giant string over and over and over and over again. If you explode it into a collection, now all of a sudden you only have one step to get to it, right? You can just ask for the collection number and you get right to it. So when I did that, I saw, oh, that was an 80% reduction. So that giant, so if you have 100 digits and you have 5,000 values, that's where I saw a real significant drop. I saw, oh, wow, that went from 23 seconds to 5 seconds. And the same kind of works with with arrays. If you're talking about unpacking and repacking arrays, you know, on the small end, you're probably doing fine with native. As you get more and more, you know, you start to talk about 5,000 values of 100 characters each. I saw a pretty significant difference. I mean, that was cutting down the time from 90 seconds almost to 4 seconds. So 85 seconds to 3.9 seconds. And I'll put the file out there and you can test it and mess with it. You know, I'm sure M1s work different from Intel's and server works different from client and all that jazz. But it did seem like having to reach into an array and having to parse an array every time, and especially rebuilding an array, meaning I have to, when I say set element 11, it basically has to know it has to say 1 through 10, determine if there's anything missing and all this. So what I found was that once you got to these enormous arrays and you know, if you're syncing systems or something like that, you may be in a position, I know that at Beezwax, we have a couple large syncs that we do with either financial systems or things like that. And when you're talking about looking at, you know, 5,000 to 1,000 complex objects, this time difference is pretty significant. I wouldn't go beyond like a few thousand because I think it's kind of you start to hit a wall with what FileMaker can do. But I did put the recursion on collections to 1 million. So you can technically do 1 million, and I've tested it to about 200,000 and it works. Cool, so I am going to We talked about lessons. Oh, this was the last one from my direct. Don't act like you're listening, really listen. So please, I want to hear from you. That's my Beezwax email. I would love for this to go out into use and for it to become belonging to not just me, but to the community and hear, what functions might work better, what might not, Brendan already said, what about a slice where you could get, I want to get the 10 to 19 array pieces and take them out. What about sorting, all that stuff, so I'm all for beefing this thing out to the level that it can kind of do what everyone wants. So yeah, please, I'll put the I don't know how best to get the file out, but I will put it out through Eric, and then we'll have a blog post on Beezwax probably next week about this. Okay, cool. I'm going to leave this up to anybody who has any questions. And I am very happy to talk about it. But I also know that it is past 7 or 10 if you're on the East Coast.
Thank you, Nat. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Eric, Vince, Jay, for having me.
Thank you, Steve.
Once again, I worked super hard this week, so you guys are very welcome.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Just curious to know in terms of preserving, like you said, the text format and the container data and stuff like that. At what point do you have to start watching for losing any of that, if any? Like in terms of parameter passing into a script, or in terms of getting to reach into one file to the next file? I'm asking that because it's using variables, but at the same time, like when we're sending in to a parameter, I would suspect that the parameter would preserve the formatting, but I'm not too sure about the container stuff. So can you just share a bit more on that end?
Yeah. So a parameter, if you just give it, like if you give a parameter a field, it will go and it will keep it if that's all you give, not as a JSON object or an array, but if you give a parameter a field directly, it will keep it as rich text, or it will keep it as a file. I don't know how talking to a server or talking to another solution works. I haven't tried that, but I know that if you pass a field value or you pass a, I actually don't know about a binary file, whether you can just pass that. That'd be interesting. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if that works. If it's a reference, if you pass a reference, like a field reference, it'll save the integrity of what you had. If you pass a variable, I believe it'll save the integrity of what you had. Yeah. So if you basically pass it as the chunk that it is, like as the field or as the variable, which is really just a reference to this rich text or binary object, then it'll keep it. But once you try to convert it to anything else, and like if you try to touch it with any kind of parser, it'll just figure out what it can see as plain text from it.
Okay, so are you passing maps and collections as parameters, or you cast it into text and you push the text over them?
If I'm within a solution and it makes sense, I will make it a global collection or a global map. And I may pass the name of the map, especially if maybe the map names are IDs, like in that mail solution. Yeah, because you just need the pointer to it if it's global.
Mhm.
Once it's on a local, you're gonna have to convert it to a, like if you're saying I'm gonna call one script to another and I'm not gonna use a global, I'm gonna use a local map, then you convert it to, for a map you would convert it to an object, pass it over, and for a collection you would convert it to an array and pass it over. And that's if you're going between scripts. Yeah, that's why I do sometimes use the default to global, but you also have to remember at the end of that script or end of that usage to clear your globals if you care about the data viewer being clogged up.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And do you have one of your custom function that's a utility that like flips a local into a global or vice versa? Or?
Yeah, so for that, in that case, you would, that's what clone does. So,
I see.
yeah, dot clone. So
That,
so
yeah,
you
that
would,
answers. Yeah,
yeah, so
thank
you'd
you.
say like clone, whatever, COLL, yeah. I did, and if this gets used by enough people who have suggestions, like if it may make sense to do that in a rather than just have straight collection.new, a collection.new global, so that you don't necessarily need to have the double $sign at the beginning. You just call it a global, like maybe by a UUID or something, and then we figure out how to make it so it's like you could give a global by the same name as a local, and if you're in a script, it'll assume you're talking to the local version of it, but if not, it'll look for a local version of it first, and then if it doesn't see that, it'll go to the global, kind of like the way that variables as globals and locals work in a lot of other languages.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please, if you end up using this, I would love your feedback on what you could use more of or less of or anything. Thank you. I appreciate it, Robert.
I just stuck a question into the text, and I don't have a specific question, but I mean, there's that whole sort of niggling detail about FileMaker. If you grab a value from a date field and put it into a variable, FileMaker will type the variable as a date value. But if you're passing stuff into an array here and then you extract it from the array, FileMaker doesn't know what it has. You have to kind of tell it what you have. And I was wondering if you looked at sort of abstracting data type detection on the fly and say, oh, this looks like a date, so therefore I'm going to get it as a date when I pull it out of the array. Have you thought about stuff like this? Or
I did, yeah, exactly. And it wasn't dates that got me, it was numbers. Because numbers jumped out at me because they're specifically typed in JSON, right? And someone could easily give you something that's clearly a number, and shouldn't the JSON that you output not have quotes around that bit of the array, right? Shouldn't it just be the number? It's tough to make the assumption. Now, I will say this: if you're just dealing with a collection and you're just passing a collection around as a global, it'll keep the data typing, because if you give it a date, so I see what you're saying. If you come from an array or an object to begin with, it will just say that's text, because that's what FileMaker will give it when you put a date into a JSON object or array. It'll store it as the text of it. But if you leave it as a collection, purely as a collection or as a map, and that's a global that you can pass around, then it'll keep its typing that FileMaker had. It won't mess with that. That's actually a really nice point to think about, that if you're trying to save the integrity of a date, putting it as a collection or a map parameter or a map element will keep it as its date. And the same thing for numbers. It won't, if it has typed it as a number, it won't mess with it. Whereas the toObject and toArray functions of collections and maps, they only check to see, is that a valid cast to? Oh, that's an interesting one. The collection output and the array output and the map output only look at, is this an array that I've got? Is this an object that I got? So that it will it'll build what it's got in a way that you could nest, you could get element by a nest. But everything else it treats as string, because I couldn't figure out a way that I trusted to do that. And I'm not completely against it. I just I don't have the logic in my head for, if I give it, is there a way that I can look at a collection element that is basically just a variable, right? Which, if it was set, it has a date. It'll know it's a date, or a timestamp, it'll know it's a timestamp, number will know it's a number, file, blah, blah. Is there a way that if I have that, I can tell what that is? I can ask FileMaker what that is, and then I can, when I go to array it, I can go, okay, I know how to put that in as, I will array its piece as a date piece. That is a really interesting one. When we get this file out and you look at how the toArray function works, it basically takes each piece and then just says set element 0, set element of a blank array, element 0 to this. And if it's determined it's an object, it'll say as object. If it's determined it's an array, it'll say as array. And if it's anything else, it'll say as string. So that also means that if something came in as null, it's not going to have a value in the collection. I mean, it'll have an empty space in the collection. There won't be one of these, right? That won't exist. But when it goes to write it to the toArray function, it's just going to say, okay, well, I'm not an object and I'm not an array, so I'm just an empty string. So it doesn't write it as null. If I could reliably tell, is this a date? Is this a number, timestamp, null, versus this is a blank string? And I don't know if FileMaker has a difference between blank string and null. I don't actually know. Then I would add that in for sure. Yeah, I think that would be an awesome way to do it. And you're right. If there is, instead of just collection dot append or set, if you could give that an extra parameter where it's like, here's the value and then here's the type, maybe that would kind of get that. That would make that work, I guess, because then you would say get as date, and maybe the collection stores a type next to it. Not only does it store the value, but it also stores an extra piece of data that's called the type. That kind of jive with what you're thinking, Chris?
It does, yeah. I'm thinking of some custom functions I've seen that sort of do like a pattern match and say, oh, we have, some numbers with a couple of slashes in there. This must be a date. Get as date, get whatever the input value was as date. And so it's crude, but I kind of like your idea of figuring out what you have on the front end and then typing it as it goes in so that when it comes out, it knows what it has.
Yeah. Like I said, if I had a reliable way that I knew of like what you're saying, I would add that in and say, cool, we know that's a number, cast it as a number. We know that's a date, cast it as a date. Yeah. Maybe you guys will mess around with the Omega file and figure it out.
Yeah, I like the Omega. It sort of harkens back to the old OASIUM days.
I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. I don't get that.
Ask Vince about those legendary times.
Wow. Legendary times. Cool. Yeah, I look forward to. I always get good stories from Vince.
On a day when I'm more awake. Not
I know, Vince. It is like 3 a.m. where you are. I really appreciate you staying up with us, man.
once a month.
Cool. Anyone else have any questions? Is there an easy way to share this file?
We'll work it out with Eric, but I think you mentioned it that it'll be on a blog post too. So one way or another, we'll get it. We'll get it out there.
Cool.
Thanks, Nat. I'm gonna hop off. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Yeah. If it's getting late for everybody, so if anybody has any more questions, ask them now. But also, I'll put my email back up. I'll put it in the chat right now. I don't know if it was on the.
I'll mention one other thing before we wrap up, and that is, through the last two or 3 months, it's been a little bit of a last-minute rush to get speakers. So, also wanted to mention to people who have, like Robert, thank you in the past for jumping in and speaking at the last minute. But we're kind of getting ahead of the curve now, so we do have a speaker for next month, and that's Tony White, who will be speaking, and look forward to that. And then we already have a speaker lined up for the following month after that, so look forward to those announcements. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks for the show.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nat.